On April 1st, 2013, at Fudan University, a seemingly ordinary morning turned deadly. In dorm room 421, Huang Yang poured himself a glass of water from the shared dispenser, completely unaware that it contained a fatal dose of poison. His roommate, Lin Senhao, watched calmly from across the room, his face giving nothing away. Huang and Lin couldn't have been more different. Huang, warm and sociable, was well liked, while Lin, intense and introverted, kept mostly to himself. Yet small jokes and casual remarks from Huang had, unbeknownst to him, ignited a silent resentment in Lin's mind. To Lin, each comment was a reminder of insecurities he hid from everyone. In the days that followed, Huang's health rapidly declined, leaving doctors and friends puzzled. Lin continued to interact with him, even reassuring him that all would be fine. But when questioned by the police, Lin eventually confessed, his explanation chilling in its simplicity. Just for fun. The shocking revelation shattered the campus community, turning what seemed like a trivial grudge into a tragedy that left an entire nation grappling for answers. In this episode, we talk about the poisoning case at Fudan University in China. Lin Senhao and Huang Yang had both arrived at Fudan University with high aspirations, each aiming to make a mark in the world of medicine. As classmates in the prestigious medical school, they represented two distinct paths to academic success. Lin, a native of Guangdong, was known for his intensity and intelligence. He'd grown up in a modest household, working his way through rigorous exams and challenging coursework to earn his place at Fudan. Described by those close to him as meticulous and focused, Lin was a model of academic discipline. His drive set him apart, and he prided himself on his perfectionism, often staying late in the lab, tinkering with experiments long after others had gone home. Huang Yang, on the other hand, was vibrant and social, with a smile that brightened any room he entered. Originally from Sichuan province, he balanced his demanding studies with an active social life, participating in volunteer work, sports, and student organizations. Known for his love of travel and community work, Huang was the type of person who brought people together. His achievements went beyond academics. He was both a strong student and a natural leader, popular among his peers and professors alike. The two young men's paths crossed when they became roommates in the university's dormitory. While they shared a room, they didn't share much else. Huang's friendliness and openness contrasted sharply with Lin's quiet intensity. And though they maintained a civil relationship, minor frictions arose from time to time. What Huang considered lighthearted banter, joking about Lin's reserved nature and his tendency to keep to himself, was something Lin began to internalize. These were the kinds of comments that Lin would replay in his mind, each one adding fuel to a slow-burning resentment. Beneath his disciplined exterior, Lin carried feelings of inadequacy that he kept well hidden, even from himself. His desire to prove himself, to be recognized as more than just a top student, intensified with each perceived slight. As the months went on, what had started as small irritations began to grow. Huang's easygoing manner and seemingly endless energy became a source of silent frustration for Lin. While Lin was alone in his introspective world, Huang seemed to thrive in social settings, effortlessly charming everyone around him. To Lin, it felt as though Huang was constantly shining a light on his own shortcomings, not through direct confrontation, but simply by being himself. One night, the conversation turned to their families and upbringings. Huang, laughing, made a comment about phoenix men, a term referring to men from humble beginnings who achieve success through relentless hard work. He joked that Lin was a phoenix man, someone who had risen from modest circumstances to become a brilliant student. Huang's intentions were innocent, but Lin's reaction was far from it. The comment struck a nerve, reviving a sense of self-doubt and humiliation that Lin had long suppressed. In his mind, the joke had become something deeper, a reminder of the insecurities he fought to overcome. What others saw as harmless ribbing was, for Lin, an affront to his identity. He had spent years proving his worth, climbing his way through the academic ranks, and maintaining a relentless pursuit of excellence. Yet, here was Huang, effortlessly charismatic and unbothered by the pressures that seemed to weigh so heavily on Lin's mind. With every passing day, Lin's resentment intensified, festered, and morphed into something darker. The laughter of his roommate echoed in his mind, his words twisting into accusations. For most people, the pressures and resentments that Lin felt would remain as fleeting frustrations, eventually brushed aside. But for Lin, with his access to toxic chemicals and his deep familiarity with N-nitrosodomethylamine, a lethal substance he had used frequently in his research, the idea of revenge took on a chilling reality. As an experienced researcher, Lin understood the devastating effects of N-nitrosodomethylamine. Over the past 3 years, he had used it extensively in his studies on rats, meticulously injecting precise doses to study its impact on liver cells. He knew how much was needed to induce liver damage and how much could be fatal. What began as an experiment on lab rats became, in his mind, a tool for something more personal. The thought of using this substance outside the lab was one he initially dismissed. But as the days passed, the notion grew, embedding itself in his thoughts. To Lin, the act was less about vengeance and more about control, a way to assert himself over the elements of his life that felt beyond his reach. He convinced himself that he wasn't planning a murder, just an experiment. In his mind, it was about showing Huang the seriousness he perceived in himself. On the morning of April 1st, Lin rose early, his expression impassive as he walked to the lab to retrieve a small vial of N-nitrosodomethylamine. His heart was calm, steady, his mind rehearsing the process step by step. He poured the clear liquid into the dormitory water dispenser, watching as it dispersed and blended, invisible to the eye. He returned to his room, the minutes stretching into hours as he waited, the silence of the room pressing in around him. When Huang finally poured himself a glass of water, Lin's expression remained as it always was, cool, composed, unreadable. Within hours, Huang began to feel the effects. He complained of stomach pain, his face pale and clammy as he excused himself from class, clutching his abdomen. By the next day, his symptoms had intensified, and his friends urged him to seek medical attention. They crowded around him, their concern genuine, their shock growing as his condition deteriorated. By the third day, Huang was admitted to the hospital, his condition worsening with each hour. Huang's friends and family gathered at his bedside, clinging to hope as doctors worked tirelessly to understand what was happening to him. None of them suspected that the cause of Huang's suffering was in the very room where he had lived, where he had shared laughter and late-night conversations with his roommate. The doctors ran test after test, but N-nitrosodomethylamine was so rare, so unusual, that it didn't cross their minds as a possibility. Lin remained close, offering Huang calm reassurances, even conducting an ultrasound on him when Huang asked for a second opinion. "Nothing to worry about," he told him, his voice level, as though nothing were amiss. His face betrayed no hint of guilt or remorse. He was as detached as ever, his demeanor so ordinary that no one suspected anything. As Huang's condition became critical, the doctors grew increasingly suspicious, and police were called to investigate. Initially, the authorities could find no clear leads. There were no apparent motives, no suspects. But with each passing day as they examined the case more closely, they began to notice small discrepancies in Lin's behavior. He had recently stopped drinking water from the dormitory dispenser, a small detail, but one that drew their attention. On April 11th, Lin was brought in for questioning. When confronted by police, he maintained his usual calm demeanor, providing vague answers to their inquiries. He avoided eye contact, his responses carefully measured. But the pressure of the investigation was mounting, and on his second round of questioning, Lin finally broke. In a flat, emotionless tone, he admitted to poisoning his roommate, offering only a cold, unsettling justification. Just for fun. The confession sent shockwaves through the university and the public at large. Here was a man who, by all outward appearances, was the model of academic success and discipline. He was celebrated, respected, even admired by his peers. And yet, with 3 simple words, he had shattered the lives of those who knew him, revealing a darkness no one had imagined. As the details of Lin's confession spread, the public grappled with the incomprehensible nature of his actions. How could a promising student with so much potential commit such a callous crime? Mental health experts weighed in, analyzing Lin's statements, his demeanor, and the meticulous nature of his plan. They began to piece together a psychological profile that was as complex as it was disturbing. Lin's perfectionism and intense self-discipline, combined with a tendency toward introversion, had likely isolated him emotionally from those around him. Classmates described him as strange and quiet, noting that he rarely shared his thoughts or feelings openly. He had, in many ways, become a prisoner of his own mind, burdened by expectations that no one else could see. Some suggested that Lin's need for control and validation, paired with his familiarity with toxic chemicals, had fueled a warped sense of power. He had sought to assert himself, to prove that he was more than what others thought of him, even if it meant taking another's life. The simple act of mixing a poison into water was, to Lin, an experiment in control, a chance to prove to himself that he could influence life and death with the same precision he applied to his studies. The arrest of Lin Senhao sent shockwaves throughout Fudan University and the wider community. The media swarmed over the story, eager to uncover every detail of the case that had captivated the nation. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors built a case that painted Lin as a cold, calculated killer who had meticulously planned the poisoning of his roommate. The trial began in early 2014 at the Shanghai No. 2 Intermediate People's Court. The courtroom was packed with journalists, students, and members of the public, all eager to witness the proceedings of a case that had become a national sensation. Lin appeared in court wearing a calm expression, his demeanor as reserved as ever. The prosecution presented a wealth of evidence against him: his confession, records of his access to the toxic chemical, and testimonies from classmates and professors. Lin's defense team faced an uphill battle. They argued that Lin had not intended to kill Huang Yang, but merely to make him ill as a misguided prank. They highlighted Lin's exemplary academic record and lack of a prior criminal history, suggesting that his actions were out of character and possibly the result of mental health issues. They requested a psychological evaluation, hoping to establish diminished responsibility due to mental instability. However, the prosecution countered that Lin's actions were premeditated and demonstrated a clear intent to harm. They pointed to his extensive knowledge of N-nitrosodomethylamine, his access to the substance, and the deliberate act of introducing it into the water dispenser. The prosecutors emphasized the betrayal of trust inherent in the crime, noting that Lin had continued to interact with Huang after the poisoning without showing any signs of remorse or concern. Throughout the trial, Huang Yang's family sat in the courtroom, their faces etched with grief. They listened as the details of their son's suffering were recounted, each revelation reopening the wounds of their loss. Huang's father gave a heartfelt testimony about his son's dreams and aspirations, painting a picture of a life full of promise that had been cruelly cut short. Public opinion was largely unsympathetic towards Lin. The media portrayed him as a villain, and social media platforms were filled with calls for justice. Many were horrified by the idea that someone could commit such an act against a roommate, a person with whom they shared daily life. The betrayal struck a chord, leading to widespread condemnation. On February 18, 2014, the court delivered its verdict. Lin Senhao was found guilty of intentional homicide and was sentenced to death, with the deprivation of political rights for life. The judge stated that the severity of the crime, the premeditation involved, and the lack of genuine remorse warranted the harshest penalty under the law. Lin's legal team immediately filed an appeal, arguing that the sentence was too severe and that insufficient weight had been given to mitigating factors, such as his mental state and lack of prior offenses. They requested that the higher court reconsider the sentence, perhaps commuting it to life imprisonment. The appeal was heard by the Shanghai High People's Court in December 2014. During this phase, the defense presented additional arguments regarding Lin's psychological condition. They introduced expert testimony suggesting that Lin might have been suffering from depression or other mental health issues that impaired his judgment. However, the appellate court upheld the original verdict. In their judgment, they acknowledged the defense's arguments, but concluded that the evidence did not support a significant mental disorder that would diminish Lin's responsibility. The court maintained that Lin was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Following the appellate court's decision, the case was submitted to the Supreme People's Court in Beijing for final review, as is required in all death penalty cases in China. The Supreme People's Court conducted a thorough examination of the case, reviewing all evidence and legal arguments. On December 8, 2015, the Supreme People's Court announced its decision to uphold the death sentence. The court's statement emphasized the calculated nature of the crime, Lin's abuse of his professional knowledge to commit murder, and the grave social harm caused by his actions. They concluded that the death penalty was appropriate given the circumstances. 3 days later, on December 11, 2015, Lin Senhao was executed by lethal injection. His execution marked the end of a legal process that had lasted over 2 years, bringing a sense of closure to Huang Yang's family and to a society that had been deeply affected by the case. The Fudan University poisoning case prompted widespread reflection on multiple levels. Educational institutions across China began to re-examine their policies regarding student mental health, laboratory safety, and the handling of hazardous materials. At Fudan University, administrators acknowledged that there were systemic issues that needed to be addressed. The ease with which Lin had accessed a deadly toxin highlighted significant lapses in laboratory security protocols. In response, the university implemented stricter controls over dangerous substances, including more rigorous tracking of chemical inventories, enhanced security measures in laboratories, and mandatory training for students handling hazardous materials. Furthermore, the university increased its investment in mental health resources, counseling services were expanded, and efforts were made to reduce the stigma associated with seeking psychological help. Workshops on stress management, interpersonal relationships, and conflict resolution were introduced, aiming to create a more supportive campus environment. The case also sparked national conversations about the pressures faced by students in China's highly competitive educational system. The intense focus on academic achievement, often at the expense of personal well-being, was scrutinized. Educators and policymakers debated how to balance the pursuit of excellence with the need to support students' mental and emotional health. Media coverage of the case brought attention to the importance of mental health awareness. Discussions on television, newspapers, and online platforms emphasized the need for early intervention and the availability of support systems for students struggling with psychological issues. The government began to consider policies aimed at integrating mental health education into school curricula. For Huang Yang's family, the loss was immeasurable. Their son had been on the cusp of a promising career, his future bright with possibilities. The pain of his absence was a daily reality, a void that could never be filled. The conclusion of the legal process provided some measure of justice, but it could not heal the wounds left by his death. Lin Senhao's family also grappled with the aftermath. They faced social stigma, grief, and confusion over their son's actions. Reports indicated that Lin's parents struggled to reconcile the image of the diligent, respectful son they knew with the individual who had committed such a heinous crime. They too became the subject of public scrutiny, their lives forever altered by the events that had unfolded. The tragedy brought to light the far-reaching consequences of a single act of violence, not only for the victim and perpetrator, but also for their families, friends, and communities. It underscored the importance of addressing underlying issues before they escalate into irreversible actions. The Fudan University poisoning case became a catalyst for change, prompting educational institutions to take a proactive stance on mental health. Researchers and psychologists delved into the factors that contribute to student stress and the potential for psychological crises. Studies revealed that many students experienced high levels of anxiety and depression, often exacerbated by academic pressures and a culture that stigmatized mental health struggles. The competitive environment in universities, especially in elite institutions like Fudan, was identified as a contributing factor to students' emotional challenges. In response, universities began to implement programs aimed at fostering a healthier academic culture. Peer support networks were established, and faculty members received training to recognize signs of mental distress among students. Efforts were made to encourage open dialogue about mental health, breaking down barriers that previously prevented students from seeking help. Additionally, there was a push to incorporate ethical education into scientific training, recognizing that knowledge of hazardous materials carries significant responsibility. Educational programs began to emphasize the ethical considerations of scientific research and practice. Students were taught not only the technical aspects of their fields, but also the moral implications of their work. Years after the tragic events, the legacy of the Fudan University poisoning case continues to influence Chinese society. The case is frequently cited in discussions about student well-being, laboratory safety, and the ethics of scientific research. Educational materials often reference the case as a cautionary tale, highlighting the importance of addressing interpersonal conflicts and the potential consequences of unchecked resentment. It serves as a stark reminder of the need for compassion, communication, and support within academic communities. Moreover, the case has contributed to a gradual shift in attitudes toward mental health in China. While challenges remain, there is a growing recognition of the importance of psychological well-being as an integral part of overall health. Government initiatives have begun to allocate more resources to mental health services, aiming to make support more accessible to those in need. The story of Lin Senhao and Huang Yang is a complex and tragic one, encompassing themes of ambition, isolation, mental health, and the profound impact of personal choices. It is a narrative that forces a confrontation with uncomfortable questions about the pressures of modern life and the ways in which individuals cope, or fail to cope, with them. For educational institutions, the case underscores the critical role they play in shaping not only the minds, but also the character and well-being of their students. It highlights the necessity of creating environments where students feel supported, where they can seek help without fear of stigma, and where the ethical dimensions of their work are given due consideration. For society at large, the case serves as a reminder of the interconnectedness of individuals within a community. The actions of one person can ripple outward, affecting countless others in unforeseen ways. It emphasizes the importance of empathy, understanding, and the proactive addressing of issues before they escalate into tragedy. Ultimately, the Fudan University Poisoning Case stands as a somber testament to the consequences of unaddressed mental health issues and the dire need for comprehensive support systems within educational settings. It is a lesson in the value of vigilance, compassion, and the collective responsibility to nurture not just the intellect, but the humanity of those within our communities.